Let us now look at another important attribute, which is float. Just like the position attribute, float also impacts the layout of an element as well as other associated elements. A thing you need to remember about float is that only elements that are positioned as static or relative can be floated. And also, as the word float itself suggests, an element can be floated either towards the left or towards the right of its containing element horizontally. Now, as you scan an HTML document from top to bottom, right? Let's say we're looking at this particular document, right? And let's assume that inside the div main page, the first div, which let's call it the left div, is not floated. The second div is floated. Then the impact of floating the second div is not visible or will not be visible on the first div. However, the impact will be visible on the second div itself, and of course all the elements that follow it. Okay, so let's just take a look at a few examples of how the float attribute impacts layout. Now, if we preview the page, we find that the three divs, right, with content left div, center div, and right div, are actually placed next to each other horizontally. However, if you recall, a few videos earlier, we had mentioned that div is a block element, right? And therefore, the browser will introduce a line before it and after it, or in other words, no other element will be allowed to occupy the same horizontal space as a div. And yet, we have three divs, one next to the other. And how is that possible? And we've been using it for quite a few labs now. Well, let us look at the CSS. If you look at the class members in the CSS, you find that we have specified the float attribute and assigned it a value left. So all along we've been floating these divs to the left, right? So therefore, as we kind of expect, the first div takes up the leftmost position, the second div or the center div takes up the space next to it on the right. The third div then takes up the space next to the center div on the right. And although the span element that follows the right div does not have a float defined, by the definition of float, it flows around the floated elements and takes up whatever space is available, right? So this is how float impacts the positioning of these divs. Now, what would happen if we remove the float left attribute from the members class? Remember, the members class has been applied to all these three divs. Okay, so let's just remove the float attribute and preview the page. So there you go. This is what we would expect with a div element, right? This is exactly what we would expect without having a float specified. Now, what instead of specifying a float left, what if we specify a float right? What do you think is going to happen? So let's go back to the HTML and try and predict the layout of the page. So as soon as float right is applied to the left div, it moves as far as possible to the right. The center div then takes up position or space to the left of the left div, and the right div will take up space to the left of the center div. And what happens to the span? Well, again, as per the definition, the content in the span element will flow around the floated divs and take up whatever little space is available to the left of all the three floated divs. Now, is that what really happens? Let's find out. So there you go. This is exactly what we expected. So just experiment with float, try and also play around with combinations of position and float. What happens if you specify relative positions to some or all of these divs? What happens if you specify absolute positions? Remember, we said that float will not have an impact on elements that are not either statically positioned or relatively positioned.